The coup had been clean, precise, and utterly devastating. In the morning light of April 16, 1919, Liepāja looked unchanged. The same gray buildings, the same wind-swept harbor, the same weary faces of a population exhausted by months of war and uncertainty. But something fundamental had shifted. The legitimate government of the Republic of Latvia no longer controlled its last remaining territory. In its place stood Andrievs Niedra, a man whose authority derived not from the will of the Latvian people, but from the rifles of German soldiers. Minister Ulmanis remained aboard the steamship Saratov, protected by the British naval presence in Liepāja harbor. It was an absurd situation. The prime minister of a sovereign nation reduced to a fugitive on a ship within sight of his own land. British officers treated him with courtesy, but could offer little beyond sanctuary. Their instructions from London were to observe, to report, and above all, to avoid entanglement in a conflict whose resolution remained uncertain. The coup plotters, meanwhile, moved quickly to consolidate their position. Niedra formed a government staffed with men sympathetic to German interests, issuing proclamations that maintained the fiction of Latvian independence while systematically dismantling its substance. The Landeswehr, no longer constrained by the need to maintain appearances, expanded its operations across western Latvia. Baltic-German landowners, who had lost their estates to the provisional government's land reform initiatives, saw an opportunity to reclaim what they considered rightfully theirs. For the ordinary Latvian civilian, this was not a change of government, it was an erasure. The promise of independence had been, above all, a promise of dignity. For centuries, Latvians had been serfs, subjects, servants, their language dismissed as peasant speech, culture suppressed, their very identity subordinated to German and Russian masters. November 18th had promised something different, that Latvians would stand as equals in their own land, that the decisions shaping their lives would be made by their own people, that the future belonged to them. Now that promise lay shattered. German officers who had patronized them for generations were once again giving orders. The old hierarchies, briefly challenged, reasserted themselves with a vengeance. But the resistance did not die, transformed. Oskars Kalpaks had fallen before the coup, killed in a confused engagement on February 6, 1919, when friendly fire from German units struck the column he was leading. The circumstances remained suspicious. Kalpaks had been a vocal advocate for Latvian interests, increasingly critical of German dominance. Whether his death was an accident or something more deliberate became one of the war's enduring mysteries. What is certain is that his loss deprived the Latvian forces of their most experienced commander at the worst possible moment. Command passed to others, officers like Jānis Baltis, who would emerge as one of the defining figures of the independence struggle. Baltis, a former Russian army colonel with extensive combat experience, understood that the Latvian national forces could not defeat the combined strength of German and Bolshevik armies in conventional battle. Survival required patience, cunning, and the willingness to exploit every fracture among their enemies. The situation in April and May of 1919 was one of bewildering complexity. Latvian national units technically served alongside the Landeswehr in operations against the Bolsheviks. But the alliance was poisoned. Latvian officers knew their German counterparts had overthrown their legitimate government. German commanders knew their Latvian allies harbored resentment and might turn against them at any moment. Both sides went through the motions of cooperation while preparing for the inevitable reckoning. Meanwhile, to the north, Estonia watched with growing alarm. Estonians had fought their own war of independence against Bolshevik forces and understood intimately the danger posed by German expansionism in the Baltic. If German-led forces succeeded in dominating Latvia, Estonia would be next. This strategic calculation would prove decisive in the weeks ahead. The Baltic-German forces, for their part, grew increasingly ambitious. Having secured western Latvia, they turned their attention northward. The Landeswehr, reinforced by the Iron Division and other German volunteer formations, began advancing toward Riga, ostensibly to liberate it from Bolshevik control, but in reality, to establish German dominance over the entire country. The attack on the Bolshevik-held capital, launched in late May, succeeded beyond expectation. By May 22nd, Riga was in German hands. But this liberation brought no joy to Latvian patriots. The streets that had witnessed the declaration of independence were now controlled by forces hostile to that independence. The Niedra government moved to Riga, a puppet regime and a puppet capital, and the architects of this conquest, intoxicated by success, began planning their next move, an invasion of Estonia to complete German hegemony over the Baltic. It was here that the overreach began. The Estonian government, seeing the German advance for what it was, requested assistance from Latvian national units that had maintained their independence from the Coup regime. These forces, commanded by officers loyal to Ulmanis, faced an agonizing choice. Fighting alongside the Landeswehr against the Bolsheviks was one thing. Supporting an invasion of a fellow Baltic nation struggling for its own freedom was quite another. The decision was not difficult. In early June, Latvian national forces formally broke with the German command structure and aligned themselves with Estonia. The battle lines of the conflict shifted dramatically. What had been a war against Bolshevism became, simultaneously, a war against German domination. Latvian soldiers who, weeks before, had fought beside the Landeswehr, now prepared to fight against it. The confrontation came at Cēsis. The Germans called it Wenden, an ancient town in central Latvia that would become the symbolic birthplace of genuine Latvian military sovereignty. The Battle of Cēsis fought between June 19th and 23rd, 1919. Pitted combined Estonian and Latvian forces against the German-led armies that had controlled the region for months. The fighting was savage. Both sides understood the stakes. For the Germans, defeat would mean the collapse of their Baltic ambitions and a humiliating retreat. For the Latvians and Estonians, defeat would mean the end of independence before it had truly begun. Villages changed hands multiple times. Artillery duels shattered the summer quiet. Men who had survived years of World War fell in fields they had known since childhood. The outcome was decisive. The combined Estonian-Latvian forces inflicted a crushing defeat on the Landeswehr, shattering the myth of German military invincibility in the Baltic. The retreating German formations carried with them not only their wounded, but also their dreams of Eastern Empire. An armistice followed on July 3rd, and the Niedra government collapsed. Ulmanis returned from his shipboard exile to resume leadership of a country that had, against all odds, survived betrayal from within. But the war was far from over. The summer and early autumn of 1919 brought a fragile breathing space. The Bolsheviks still controlled eastern Latvia, including the vital region of Latgale. The German forces, though defeated, had not entirely withdrawn from Baltic soil. And a new threat was gathering, one that would test the young nation's endurance to its very limits. His name was Pavel Bermondt-Avalov, and he commanded an army of mercenaries, its adventurers, and desperate men, calling themselves the West Russian Volunteer Army. Nominally, this force existed to fight the Bolsheviks in the name of Russian restoration. In practice, it was a tool of German interests, financed, equipped, and directed by those who refused to accept their defeat at Bermondt. Brizovov himself was a character from some dark operetta, a former Cossack officer of questionable background who had reinvented himself as a prince and gathered around him a collection of German soldiers prohibited by the armistice from remaining in the Baltic under their own flag. By October, this army, numbering perhaps 50,000 men, had positioned itself in western Latvia, ostensibly preparing for operations against Soviet forces. The Latvian government, suspicious but desperate for any ally against the Bolshevik threat, allowed the force to remain. It was a decision they would bitterly regret. On October 8, 1919, Bermondt-Avalov's forces attacked not the Bolsheviks, but the Latvians themselves. The assault came without warning, without declaration of war, without any pretense of legitimate grievance. Within days, the West Russian Volunteer Army had swept through western Latvia and reached the suburbs of Riga. Once again, the capital faced conquest. Once again, the Republic fought for survival against enemies who should have been allies. The siege that followed was unlike anything Riga had experienced. Bermondt's forces bombarded the city with artillery, inflicting civilian casualties and destroying buildings that had survived the entire World War. The Latvian defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, held the Daugava River crossings with a tenacity that defied military logic. Every day they held was a day bought for diplomatic pressure to build, for reinforcements to arrive, for the international community to recognize what was happening. British naval forces in the Baltic provided crucial support. Their ships bombarding Bermond's positions and demonstrating Allied commitment to Latvian sovereignty. Estonian forces, fresh from their victory at Cēsis, sent reinforcements southward, and within Riga itself. Civilians who had endured Bolshevik occupation and German betrayal now faced yet another ordeal with exhausted resilience. The siege lasted a month. By early November, the tide had turned. Latvian counteroffensives, supported by artillery and coordinated with Estonian attacks on Bermond's flanks, began pushing the invaders back. On November 11th, the first anniversary of the armistice that ended the Great War, Latvian forces liberated the last occupied districts of Riga. Bermond's army, shattered and demoralized, retreated toward the German border, never to return. The city celebrated, but the celebrations were brief and muted. Too many had died, too much had been destroyed, and to the east, in Latvian, the region where many of Latvia's poorest and most vulnerable citizens lived, the Bolsheviks still ruled with iron severity. The war was not over. One final campaign remained, and as winter descended once more, every soldier who had survived the horrors of the past year understood that the hardest fighting might still lie ahead.